My name is Khalil.
Admittedly.
We'll continue today's literature series with our very own Mr. Varun Gopinatth, a student at St. Louis University School of Medicine. Varun, would you mind sharing your presentation with us tonight?
Professor Roberts, maybe you want to stay for this one. This is the former president of ISBS who will be discussing her work on looking at artificial turf. I guess my conversation with her at the ISBS conference sunk in. Please.
All right. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Varun. Thank you.
Just put in presentation mode. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. So I'll be presenting the article, Player-Surface Interactions, Perception in Elite Soccer and Rugby Players on Artificial and Natural Grass. So just some background information. A lot of soccer and rugby clubs are switching to artificial turf because it's a more durable, more cost efficient. As Dr. Roberts mentioned, it can be a more consistent surface than natural turf. That being said, a lot of elite players has been shown to have negative perception towards artificial turf. So the objectives of this study were to identify perceptions between artificial turf and natural turf, examine the differences in movement characteristics between artificial turf and natural turf, and then understand how awareness of playing on these individual surfaces influences movement characteristics. So to collect data on this study, the researchers got 30 elite soccer and rugby players. And the first portion of data collection was a biomechanical analysis. And what they did was they masked these athletes and had them do a movement task on both artificial and natural turf. And then they removed the mask and had them do the same movement task on artificial and natural turf. And then they used a camera to identify different factors such as velocity, contact time, flight time, and seeing how they differ between these different conditions. And this cartoon down here kind of shows a movement task they had to do. So the athlete would start and then run 10 steps, do a 180-degree turn, run 6 steps, do a cut, and then finish. And then so for the second portion of the data collection, they would have the athletes do a survey in which they would describe their perceptions and their feelings towards the different surfaces. So in terms of results, as you would expect, when the athletes were masked, they were a lot more cautious, which led to decreased velocity, shorter step length, shorter absolute distance between start to each step, and then longer contact time on the cut. In terms of the survey, the athletes felt that the natural turf better supported deceleration. And then perhaps the most important finding was that under mask conditions, so when the athletes were not aware that they were on different surfaces, both the natural turf and artificial turf were perceived as similar, and they had similar results in biomechanical analysis. However, under unmasked conditions, when the athletes were aware that they were either on a natural turf or artificial turf, the athletes perceived natural turf as significantly more useful, easier to use, and it provided more control. And then finally, rugby players were more likely to accept the artificial turf compared to soccer players. So for the discussion, so overall performance between the surfaces when players are unaware is constant. However, when the players were aware of a surface, they performed more poorly on the artificial turf. So the main conclusion from this finding was that these elite players did possess a pre-existing bias against artificial turf that negatively influence performance. So the authors recommend some type of marketing and educative initiative to help these elite players better understand artificial turf. So in terms of limitations, it was a relatively small sample size of 30 athletes that became even smaller when 7 soccer players were excluded in the biomechanical analysis. And then with regards to future directions, so with the biomechanical analysis, they used a camera to identify factors such as velocity, contact time, flight time, etc. Unfortunately, that type of analysis doesn't give us information on how artificial turf intrinsically affects the athlete's musculoskeletal system. So if we're looking at factors such as joint loading, kinematics, kinetics, and muscle activation, are definitely factors they want to look at in the future to see how that might differ on artificial turf versus natural turf. So, and here's the references, and I'm open to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Varun. As he asked, if anybody would like to expound, or Dr. Lopez, we're opening the floor to any questions.
Can you go back 2 slides, Varun?
Right here.
Now, while we're from 7, sample size is 30 athletes with data from 7 soccer players being excluded for biomechanical analysis.
Yeah.
What happened with those players' data? Why did they exclude them?
So, from my understanding, so if you look at this, oops. So if you look at this cartoon here, it's supposed to be on a 2D plane where they're running like basically back and forth. But some of the soccer players deviated, and because of that, the camera couldn't accurately figure out like the velocity and the contact time. So that's from my understanding why those 7 athletes weren't included in the analysis. Any other questions?
And the surveys, they didn't give you the survey. They didn't talk about the survey, what they asked about?
They did ask about, so they had some specific factors. They felt that the athletes on the natural turf, it was easier to use, better supported deceleration, provided more control. And this was under the masked conditions. I'm sorry, the unmasked conditions where they knew they were on the natural turf. When they were masked, they couldn't really tell the difference between the 2 different types of surfaces, according to the survey.
All right, Kira, Professor West just emailed me.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah. All right. No, thank you, Varun. Obviously, yeah, strong work. I think the concern I have is when you're masking an athlete, there's a certain amount of instability, or I mean, everyone's taking a sprint, right? Just think about it.
Yeah.
Just being masked. I think there's a reluctance bias. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to remove the bias. But what did we talk about in the first lecture this season? Special K, what did we say?
In the first lecture?
Yes, bias and everything, right?
True.
So
Lots of
So
types of bias.
these athletes are masking led to decreased velocity, shorter step lengths, absolute distance. Yeah, you're afraid you're gonna crash into something. You're just reluctant. Yeah, I don't know how else they could have done the study or conducted the study.
I know that there are running blinders that blind the bottom half of a runner's view. That may have helped in the study, but you can still, if you're tilting your head down when you run, you'll see. But that may have been made a improvement to that aspect of the study.
And did they discuss if there were any limitations in regards to the decreased velocity, shorter step, or anything like that?
No, they just mentioned that the decreased velocity, shorter step, that was similar in natural and artificial turf. There wasn't a significant difference. I think the study was more interested in comparing natural and artificial turf directly than comparing masked and unmasked. That wasn't like the focus of the study compared to the playing surface.
All right. All right. No, a good study nonetheless. I mean, to look at, and obviously I think everyone understands, the impact of it. Thank you so much, Varun. That was a good talk.
Thank you.
I have a quick comment regarding the paper.
Yeah, hit it.
It was just
Go
super
ahead.
interesting. You brought the idea of like joint loading into biomechanical testing, because usually the way you do figure out joint loading is you get someone on a force plate and then you inversely do it. So like from one joint all the way up. And not to my knowledge, there hasn't been any force plates under turf yet, but they have them for pitching mounds. So it's cool to see that there may be this trek to get joint loading onto these player surfaces, or to get force plates onto these player surfaces in order to really see how loading can have an effect on perception and muscle activation and injury rates.
Thank you, Jasmine. Our next speaker is Miss Sasha Smalls from Valley Stream North High School. Sasha, if you're prepared with your presentation, would you please share?
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Can you please present?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Today we'll be presenting an article from the Journal of International Society, from the International Society of Sports Nutrition. And that article is titled Nutritional Knowledge and Eating Habits of Professional Rugby League Players, and Does This Knowledge Translate into Practice? So first, I'd like to begin with a brief background of some 5 essential principles that this paper touches upon, and these are also essential principles towards the nutrition of rugby athletes as a whole. So it goes without saying that rugby is a physically demanding sport characterized by repeated changes in exercise intensity, and these physiological demands place heavy requirements on the body's fuel stores. So it's important that there is adequate nutritional intake so that there is the promotion of overall health and optimal training and performance at these competitions. So therefore, the nutritional knowledge of elite athletes and their coaches is important, but we find that it's often inadequate. And in order to have proper food habits and proper food choices, it's important that these athletes at first have this proper nutritional knowledge. So there's a strong association with the knowledge of healthy eating habits, and then this reflected into these habits. So directly from there, the study's aim began to take shape, and this is to determine the general nutrition knowledge and eating habits based on the Eat Well principal food group categories of elite rugby players. And this is for essentially what is the heart of this study, and that is any association between good or poor nutritional knowledge and eating habits in this population. And Eat Well is just a recommended line that is used in the UK. It's similar to My Plate that we have in America. So first and foremost, there were questionnaires distributed to male rugby players on one team competing in the English Super League, and they ranged from the ages of 18 to 34. All participants had educational qualifications such as the GSCEs, A-levels, diplomas, and these roughly translate into high school diploma with AP or honors, and then a undergraduate degree. And the majority of these athletes fell into one of these three education levels. Next, they distributed a nutritional knowledge questionnaire and a food frequency questionnaire, and these were respectively shortened to NKQ and FFQ. And the NKQ gauged advice, food groups, and food choice. So that's how they kind of gauge the nutritional knowledge of these athletes, while the food frequency, while the other one gauged their knowledge and their consumption of various food groups, ranging in those 7 categories that I have listed out for you. And both of these questionnaires were distributed prior to a training session, and they were collected straight after completion. So immediately, there were only 21 questionnaires that were considered viable for the study, and this was due to partial completion of those 9 questionnaires. So this resulted in about 30% of the questionnaires being excluded from the study. And of these 21 that were subsequently analyzed, the mean ended up being 73% in terms of their nutritional knowledge. So they found that these athletes had about adequate nutrition knowledge, and the highest scores were as follows: advice, food groups, and food choice. And then from there, they split the players up based on the mean into 2 subsequent categories. And these were good nutrition knowledge and poor nutrition knowledge. And as I mentioned earlier, the heart of this study was to see if better nutrition knowledge translated into habits. So then they took these 2 cohorts and then looked at their FFQ to see how their nutrition knowledge translated into their food intake. So they found that 11 of the 21, which were the good nutrition knowledge, they found that they usually ate foods that were, they ate more vegetables and fruits as compared to the poor nutrition knowledge, who also were shown to have more consumption of fizzy drinks and juices. So they just thought that this was an important point to point out, given the aim of the study, that the better nutrition knowledge that they found, the better food habits that these athletes had. So one immediate limitation, similar to the previous presentation that we saw, was there were only 30 athletes in this study, and we lost 9 of those surveys due to partial completion, and that ended up translating into 30% of the surveyed group. So that's a significant number given the small sample size. And some of the other points that the authors pointed out were that all participants in the poor nutrition knowledge group and nearly half of the good nutrition knowledge group answered questions on starchy food consumption incorrectly. And they believe that this is due to popular media and how they portray foods high in carbohydrates as being unhealthy. And that is what they believe led to these participants answering these questions incorrectly. Next, there was a positive association between overall nutrition knowledge and the consumption of fruits and vegetables, which was, like I said, what the study aimed to, what they set out to determine. But it was also interesting to point out that there were similar observations reported with the general UK population. So this is also consistent with the first bullet, where it's probably due to the fact of popular media and, you know, how that these athletes they believe that vegetables and fruits represent healthy food based off what they see in the media. So that would probably be the reflection of why the good nutrition knowledge group had those habits. And then finally, the concept of nutritional knowledge encompasses two elements, and that is the knowledge of nutrition and then procedural knowledge. So that's, like I said before, their habits, and that's things like planning and purchasing and preparation of foods. So therefore, if nutrition knowledge is adequate, but the procedural knowledge is poor, it is unlikely that nutritional knowledge would play a big role in the adoption of healthier food habits. Nevertheless, the link between knowledge and fruit and vegetable consumption was identified, and that suggests that improving other domains of nutritional knowledge may be beneficial in improving overall diet in this population of rugby athletes. And that is what the authors did set out to determine, and they did find that. So in terms of the future, the researchers suggest having qualified nutritional specialists on these teams to give positive and proper nutritional advice to these athletes and their coaches in order to further promote the adoption of healthy food habits and their consumption. So thank you for watching. I would now like to open the floor to any questions.
I actually have a question. Great presentation, by the way. So I thought it was interesting how athletes were unaware of the recommendations and guidelines surrounding carbohydrate intake and how the public perception of carbohydrate-rich food is unhealthy. Because this really resonated with me, because usually when I'm around athletes or physically active people, they usually have more of a focus on protein rather than carbohydrates. And this is funny because it's really the majority of your energy is really coming from the carbohydrates. So I was wondering, why do you think there's a public perception, a negative public perception surrounding carbohydrate-rich foods?
Well, based off my knowledge of nutrition, I believe most people find that carbohydrates, well, at least what I've learned in school, is that most carbohydrates, you learn about simple sugars and complex carbs, and the simple sugars are what you get from like sugary drinks or fizzy drinks, or most of the fast food or food that is considered unhealthy is usually simple sugars, and that does fall into the realm of carbohydrates. So I think there's a negative association between carbohydrates and simple sugars, and I think the main issue is separating simple sugars from complex carbohydrates and not looking at simple sugars as the entire umbrella of carbohydrates. And I feel that if we can take that step and then have that translate into athletes and their own nutritional knowledge, they'll be able to see that you can consume carbs, or the correct type of carb, without eating unhealthy foods. So carbs are usually associated with like cake or like I said, fizzy drinks, whereas you can have proper carbs and like whole grain bread and more fiber rich foods. And I think if we take that step of separating those two, I think it would hopefully help with the negative stigma.
I just wanted to add on that. I agreed with Eric. I think it's really interesting because I think in a lot of sports, you kind of hear the term like carbo load before an event or something to increase energy. So I think this was kind of an interesting article that actually showed that the opposite was going on. I just wanted to kind of comment on that terminology and put that out there as well.
I also wonder if that's due to the culture surrounding the sport, or this idea that of strength and musculature and needing all that, as opposed to, you know, like carbo loading, which is like your pasta parties before a soccer game, or like before a run within reason. Maybe this movement towards protein has to do with culture surrounding a sport. And I wonder if you were to look at football or something else where they focus on, lifting highly within their sport or something, how diets may be comparable.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Well, thank you, Sasha. That was a wonderful presentation. It's definitely important to look at nutrition when it comes to fueling an athlete. That concludes our 5th week of 2021 summer series. We'd like to thank Professor Simon Roberts and our guests and our cohort speakers. Thank you, and please join us for another series as our series continues.